If you want some paper to write on, anybody that doesn't have blue, there's some note paper up here. Just raise your hand. Bring some. Okay. Let me open this up so I have my notes in front of me. All right. So, we are starting today with the actual life and times of Jesus, life and times of Christ, if you will. And we're first going to start off with the genealogies. Now, do you remember or do you know in your reading through the Bible that there are two genealogies? Everybody know that? Yes. Okay. So I listed them here as Matthew 1, first 17 verses, and then towards the end of Luke chapter 3 in the Bible. Okay. Why do you suppose, well, two questions really for you to think on. Why do you suppose there would be two? Or, ask another way, why wouldn't there be four? Why wouldn't Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all four of them, have genealogies? And if somebody's going to have them, why do you need more than one? Anybody got an idea on that?
The question you're giving is, why is it in the Bible more often?
Well, it could be there four times. In other words, what's the emphasis? What's the point of two? And why don't Mark and John have one? Laura?
One of them.
Okay. First of all, as you will know, if you've done any ancestry work or any genealogical work yourself, you know, of course, you have two parents. And therefore you have two families to follow. And then, of course, what happens? What happens, like with me, I love genealogy, but I don't dare open it and start working in it because it goes on forever. Because what do you have? Well, you have two families, then you have four families, or three anyway, and then you've got 6 and 8 and 10 and 12. And if you're just following your surname, okay, you're just following your last name, that's okay. But if you get distracted and you start following one of the spouses, one of the women and their families, and then maybe of course they have other families branching out all over the place, you can get lost. And that's true of everybody, because everybody's got two parents, and every parent has two parents, and every grandparent has two parents, and yeah. Okay, so you have of course to follow Mary, you follow Joseph. Now you would expect that for a long time, let's say if you start with the beginning, you go back to, let's say, Abraham, for example. You would expect that the genealogies would be the same for quite a while. And they wouldn't start diverging until thousands of years later. Okay? That's partly true, but not completely. So there are two reasons why there are two genealogies. Part of it is Mary's family and Joseph's family. That's part of it. Okay? And that is to show, so the first reason is, that is to show that both Mary and Joseph descend from the same great ancestor, which would be David, King David. So that both Mary's family and David's family and Joseph's family come from the line of David. Now, they're so many generations apart that you don't have to worry about them marrying each other, all right, as far as, being too closely related. You know in the Bible, of course, that it's against God's law for first cousins to be married, well, also for brothers and sisters, obviously. So in the Bible, it's the lines drawn, actually after that. The line includes aunts, uncles, first cousins, and second cousins. So you can't marry your brother, you can't marry your sister, you can't marry your niece, your nephew, you can't marry your first cousin or your second cousin. That's what God stipulated in the Bible. Now, why didn't he do that earlier? Why? Because, who did Cain marry? Cain had to marry his sister. No two ways about it. Also, Abraham and Abraham and Sarah were brother and sister. Most Christians don't know that, but that's a fact. Now, they were only half brother and sister. They had the same father, but two different mothers. This also reminds us that polygamy was very common long before Solomon and all that, right? So, in other words, but Abraham, of course, came before Moses. Moses is the one that God directed to give this law about blood relations, not marrying. Now, I could spend a lot more time talking about why, but the basic thought is this. In the early days, when humanity was a low population, so in the days, for example, of Adam and Eve, we don't know how many children Adam and Eve had. Some Jewish scholars, citing sources that we no longer have, talk about them having 190 children, or in some cases I've heard 70, I've heard 125, I've heard all kinds of numbers. When you live 900 years, 190 kids, that's like falling off a log. That's nothing. Okay? What?
You're not eat that long.
Well, possibly. I mean, in 900 years, she was created mature. In other words, Eve was not created as an infant, right? She was created mature. That's your answer, by the way, to anybody who asks you which came first, the chicken or the egg. According to the Bible, it's very clear. The chicken came first. Because Adam and Eve were not created as embryos. Okay? They were not created as zygotes, okay, or even as 2 or 3 day old babies. They were created as mature human beings, so they could have children immediately. There's no reason why they couldn't have had children before the fall. The Bible says, or the Bible's silent on that. The Bible says that they did not have children until after the fall. But there's no reason they couldn't have had children before the fall. They just didn't. Okay, so anyway, when you've got a small population, and that population is in the very beginning, right? You're not as likely, well, first of all, you don't have a lot of mutations yet. We know that since the fall, all creatures have mutations now. It's not just humans. I saw a picture the other day of a deer, a baby deer, doe, fawn, whatever. It was black and white with black spots. They called it a Dalmatian deer. Okay? Now, in a green forest, that's going to stick out like a sore thumb, right? So that's a mutation. That's not going to help that critter survive.
Target on.
Yeah. So anyway, mutations happen to everyone. The problem is if a person has a mutation and his sister has a mutation, if they would get married, that would double the mutation. Okay? So if A has a mutation and he marries X, and X doesn't, or at least doesn't have that mutation, the chances, if they have 4 children, the chances are 1 in 4 that one of those children is going to pick up that mutation, whatever it is. Okay? So far, so good. All right. But if person A marries another person with the same mutation, A, and they get married, they're going to have twice the chance. The chances of 2 out of 4 of their children are going to have this mutation. Now, if the mutation is benign, all right, in other words, your mutation is moles and freckles like I got, all right, then that's not much of a problem, really. I mean, you could get skin cancer, yeah, but that's usually not the case, right? If, on the other hand, your mutation is hemophilia, which is what they had in the royal families in Europe, Queen Victoria had hemophilia. They're not sure exactly which ancestor she got it from, but she did have it. Because she had so many children, and because so many of those children were married into the royal families of all the rest of Europe, now all the royal families of Europe have hemophilia. Tsar Nicholas's youngest son had hemophilia very bad. He had a very bad case of it, and he almost died numerous times. This is how Rasputin, in case you're interested, this is how Rasputin got into the good graces of Tsar Nicholas. He convinced Alexandria, Tsar Nicholas's wife, that he could cure her son. What was her son's name? I can't even remember now. He could cure her son's hemophilia. Of course, he couldn't, but she was convinced he could, and so Rasputin became an important member of the Tsar's household, and many people would blame him for leading the Tsar to bad choices and allowing for the communists to come to power. You can debate that if you want, but anyway. So there you go. Hemophilia is a bad thing. Okay, so in the early years, both after creation and after the flood, you didn't have the problem of multiplying mutations. There are some people who believe that there were no mutations or very, very few mutations at all before the flood, which is why the population was as large as it was. We estimate the population before the flood, or at the time of the flood, anywhere between 5 to 7 billion people, about the population of the world right now today. But they feel they're nobody can prove it, of course, but they think that there were not that many mutations. After the flood, of course, you start with 8 people. Again, if there were any mutations yet, we don't know, but we don't think so, and there was no reason for God to institute that rule or that law. Now, by the time you get to Egypt, and by the time you have the Jews intermarrying with each other for 400 years, you've got some problems. And you don't want to exacerbate those problems. You don't want to make those problems worse by allowing brothers, sisters, nieces, nephews, aunts, uncles, cousins, and second cousins to intermarry. That's going to cause a big problem. Now, of course, everybody's related to Abraham already. And everybody's related to the 12 sons already. Okay? The sons of Jacob. Everybody's already, all those 70 souls that went in and the 5 million that come out, they're all related to those 12 guys. So you've already got a problem. You don't want to make the problem worse. Okay? All right. So, the lines begin to diverge after David. And of course, David has a whole lot of children. He has 7 wives. We don't know exactly how many children he had, but he had a lot. Somewhere around 100. Solomon, of course, had 1,000 wives. We don't know how many children he had either. But numbers have ranged anywhere from 1,500 all the way to 5,000. So, again, just from one man. In David's case, 100, 120, whatever. Solomon, anywhere around 5,000 maybe. Okay? From one man. All right? So, whatever mutation was in that family of David and Solomon was easy to pass on, and so you gotta start weeding it out. You gotta start separating up as best you can. And so using the laws of Moses was a way to do that. Well, the other problem that you have then is how do you follow that line so that you can prove, so that Jesus can prove I am the flesh and blood son of David. Where does he get his flesh and blood from? Mary, not Joseph. Remember? It's an immaculate conception, not really an immaculate, or it's a virgin birth, virgin conception, not really a virgin birth. Virgin birth is a misnomer. It should never have been called that in the first place. It should have been called a virgin conception, but I guess that's too long. So I don't know. In any case, it wasn't. So the first purpose of the genealogies in the Bible is to show that Jesus Christ was a flesh and blood son of David through the line of Mary. The second purpose of the genealogy, and this would be Matthew's genealogy, not Luke's. Matthew's genealogy would prove that David was a legitimate son and heir, legitimate legal, really, son and heir of David through his father Joseph, his father legally. So when they would fill out a census, they would not put down Jesus was the son of Mary and God. That's not going to make the census takers happy. The census takers are going to go, huh, what? Who are they? Okay, who's he? Right? So for legal purposes, both in the nation of Israel, in the world in general, in the Roman world of his day, you're going to put down his mother's name, Mary, his father's name, Joseph. And so in Matthew, you have the line from Joseph that proves that Joseph is a legitimate, direct descendant of King David. So you've got direct descendant of David legally through Joseph, and a direct descendant physically, fleshly, bloodline through Mary. So then this is what God meant when he said, he told David, you will have a son to sit on your throne forever. So one of David's descendants would be king forever. Who is that? That's Jesus. Okay. So that's the first reason. Now there are other things that are included in the genealogy. Let's take Matthew's first of all. And if you're taking notes, I think this is an important thing to note. When you look at the genealogy of Matthew, you have 14 patriarchs. From Abraham, starts with Abraham. You have 14 from Abraham to David. What's important about the number 14? Well, what is half of 14? 7. Right, so 7 times 2 is 14. What did we say 2 is a symbol of usually? The 2 is a symbol of the means of grace, in some cases, or law and gospel, and therefore the plan of salvation. Some simpler symbolism would be emphasis, a repeat of the number that's being multiplied. Well, okay, then we're back to what does 7 stand for? Just a quick review. 1 is God. 2 is, as I say, the means of grace, gospel, something like that. 3 is the Trinity. 4, anybody? 4, no. 4 is having to do with the earth or mankind. 5, nothing that we know of, although a lot of people today would say the devil, but that's not true. Someday, some do that because of the pentagram, 5-corner. 6, definitely evil, sin, Satan, the Antichrist. Why? Because it's 1 less than 7. So what is 7? Perfection. 7 is considered the perfect prime number, for example. Prime of primes, some people call it that. The prime of primes. Okay. 8 has to do sometimes with the Old Testament, sometimes again to do with the earth in some cases. 9 has no particular significance. 10 is the number of completion. 11 is not used that much, and 12 is for the church. The Old Testament, 12 tribes of Israel. New Testament, 12 apostles. All right. So if it's 14, it's twice perfection or twice God. Okay. So there are 14 names from Abraham to David. There are another 14 names from David to the last king, Jehoiakim. The last king of Judah, Jehoiakim. Okay, so there are 14 more there. And then there are 14 names from the captivity, a man by the name of Shealtiel. There are 14 from Shealtiel to Jesus. So 14, 14, 14. Which is?
42.
22? No.
42.
42. Okay. 14, 14, and 14 is 42. Okay. 42 is 6 times 7, that's another way you can look at it. 3 times 3 times 7, and a bunch of other ways. But let's not get involved in numbers. Let's just say it's 14, 14, 14. Okay, in the genealogy of Matthew. Okay, there's a lot of important names in the genealogy of Matthew. Maybe my papers are done. Before I give you more to write on, give you something to write. Yeah. Okay. All right. Who needed papers? I'll get you the stapler in a minute. Sorry, we're out of blue paper. Going to confuse you even more. Okay. Okay. Just the next 10 pages.
Thank you.
Shaking to the camera.
Yeah.
And Jesse goes, "It's fine. Stream. Sure, it's louder for you all." And I answered, "What?"
Good for you. Anybody else? Hey, I think I have 2 more sets here. Let me get you a stapler. There it is. Just pass it behind you when you get her done. Okay, let me give you some names. All right. Did it work? Get out? Oh, you get yourself?
All the time, doesn't it?
Yep, it does. Never fails. Okay. Would you pass this to Laura? Deaf as a post.
Did they have it up? Did they use it?
Got it.
She's had it. No. Oh, Dale.
Dale, you want a stapler? Okay. So here are some names that really kind of stick out as far as the genealogy of Matthew. Of course, you got Abraham, of course, and Isaac and Jacob. Those are there for sure. You would expect those, and those show up. This is notes I'm giving you. No, I am on page 8, where it says genealogy. It says notes. If you want to write it, you don't have to. I mean, if it's not interesting to you, then don't write it down. More interesting, well, of course, is names like Rahab. Rahab is interesting for a number of reasons. Rahab is interesting because it's a woman's name. Normally in Jewish genealogies at this time in their history, you would not have women's name in there. Now, after the diaspora, after the Jewish wars, women's names become very, very important. And it just so happened that over the centuries, it has become more important to follow the line, Jewish line through women than the legal one through men. And so the Jews decided, I don't know when and I don't know where, but at some point in their history, after they left Israel, after they were thrown out of Israel by the Romans, the Jews decided that it was more important to follow the fleshly line, where you could say, okay, this person came from this woman, literally came out of this woman. Literally was born by flesh and blood, came out of this woman, rather than trying to figure out who the father was. Because again, polygamy was pretty rampant throughout history. So that's why Rahab is interesting to have, so being a woman in here. The other reason, of course, Rahab was a Canaanite. That is the most important thing. Whether she was a woman or not is not important, really, to the plan of salvation. But the fact that she was a Canaanite is important. She was from the city of Jericho. Also the fact that she was a prostitute. Woman of the evening, if you will. A sinner, if you will. Okay? That's important for the plan of salvation. So we have a Canaanite, and remember that God had determined to destroy all the Canaanites. Told Joshua, kill them all. Don't leave one of them alive. God himself made an exception in the family of Rahab. And God is allowed to make his own exceptions. So, God makes an exception in Rahab, therefore allows a Canaanite early, real early, into the line of Jesus, before it even gets to David. So we've got Canaanite blood in the Jewish line. Okay, and this of course is also the line of Judah, the number one tribe in Judaism. Number one. The vast majority of Jews to this day, if they are blood descendant from any Israelite, it would be Judah. Likely not Benjamin, and likely not the other 10 tribes that disappeared. So you got a Canaanite, or what we would today call a Palestinian, as a major part of the bloodline of Judah. Okay? Judah's not been born yet, by the way. So when Judah is born, he's got an ancestor who is 100% Canaanite. Okay? Very important. Also another one, Ruth. Of course, we know Ruth. Ruth came from Moab. Where do the Moabites come from? They come from Ishmael. We would call them Arabs. Okay? So Ruth becomes the great-grandmother of David. And Ruth is 100% Ishmaelite. Okay? Yeah. I'm sorry. Not Ishmael. I'm sorry. Lot. But yeah. Remember Lot's daughters both got pregnant by him? And they had those two boys. Okay. So Moab comes from one of those boys. Okay. But still, again, who is Lot's father? Lot's father is not Abraham. Anybody remember who Lot's father is? Okay. Is a brother of Abraham's father, Terah, I can't remember Lot's father's name off the top of my head, but he is Abraham's nephew. So one of Abraham's brothers, I think the one that died early, he had 4 brothers, and I think it was one that died early. He had a son named Lot. Lot went with him when he left Ur of the Chaldees. So he is not in the line of Abraham, folks. And yet, one of his descendants, Ruth, is a major part of the line of David. Very important. Also, she was an unbeliever. She did not originally believe in the true God, the God of Israel. So she's a pagan, as was Hagar, or Rahab. Rahab, too, was a pagan. Okay, so we have 2 pagans. We have 2 people totally outside the line of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, okay, that are now in the Jewish bloodline. Okay? You got a bunch of kings. I'm not going to go into those, of course. And then, of course, you have Joseph himself. And Joseph himself, by this time, the family of Joseph or the family of David is out of the picture as far as royalty is concerned. Nobody is trying to find a son of David to be king. Herod comes from Edom. That was the other child of Lot and his daughters. So he's not even a Jew. Edomites are not Jews. Moabites are not Jews. So Joseph, okay, Joseph is very, very poor. The royal family, the line of the royal family of David, nobody cares about it anymore. Nobody's coming to Joseph and saying, you should be the next king. That already happened hundreds of years before Joseph was born. The family became very poor. As you can see, Joseph is not living in his ancestral home, Bethlehem. He's living in Nazareth. Nazareth was a very pagan city. It was a very Gentile city. You know what they said. You know what one of the apostles said. What good comes from Nazareth? Why? Because Nazareth was nearby, not right there, but nearby there was a Roman garrison, Roman fort. And so Nazareth was a lot like Sierra Vista. It was a military town. It was right near the gates of a big Roman fort. And of course, with soldiers coming and going, and of course the soldiers from all over the world, the particular fort that was there was staffed by Syrian soldiers. It was I believe the 7th Legion. I believe it was the 7th Legion. They were stationed there near Nazareth. Nazareth also was a crossroads of travel and trade. And so a lot of Greeks lived there. A lot of Romans lived there. A lot of Persians lived there. A lot of Egyptians lived there. It had a very mixed culture. It wasn't considered a very holy place. The Jews in the genetic or racial Jews that lived in Nazareth were a minority in town, and they stuck together pretty much. This is how, when Jesus went to the synagogue in Nazareth later, it says everybody knew him. And everybody said, we know this guy. He's the son of Joseph the carpenter. He's the son of Mary, and his brothers and sisters come to this synagogue yet today. We know this family. This family's poor. This family's poorer than poor. This family is nothing but white trash. Okay? Trailer trash. That's all they are. That's basically what they said when Jesus showed up at the synagogue and stood up to speak. It's like, how dare he sit up to speak? He's not even been to a seminary. His folks didn't have enough money to send him to Jewish college or whatever. So it's very important that you understand that to have Joseph's genealogy here is fascinating, because by this time in history, nobody is following his family. Nobody is following the family of David. They don't care. The Romans could care less. They don't want any royalty to compete with theirs. Herod doesn't want it. Nobody wants it. Not even when the days of the Maccabees did they go out looking for relatives of David. Okay? Some of them showed up, but it wasn't a big deal. They were poor. So they had fallen off the royal line, so to speak, fallen off the royal wagon, if you will, long before before Joseph and Mary. Okay. So Matthew's genealogy shows Christ coming through the legal line of Joseph. And Luke's genealogy shows Christ coming through the fleshly line. If you haven't got that yet, write it down, because that's the important thing we get from this.
I'm sorry, Pastor, what was Luke?
Luke is the fleshly or earthly, if you want to say, line of Mary. So through Mary, Jesus is a blood relative of David. Through Joseph, he's a legal relative of David. So he would have a legitimate legal claim on anything that was David's family. Again, by this time, there's nothing left. But if he wanted, see, this is the other thing that people don't understand. Jesus had the perfect right, if he wanted to raise up an army and say, I am the legitimate earthly king of Israel. I am the legitimate descendant of King David. I am the legitimate descendant of the last king of Judah, which he is. And so he could say, if he wanted to, he could say, hey, everybody rally to my banner. I am the true king of Israel. Herod is not, and the Roman emperor is not. He could have led a rebellion if he wanted to. He could have led a civil war if he wanted to. He had that right. And it wouldn't have been against God's rule. It would have been against God's law. God's law says, obey the government. He should have been the government. Literally, Joseph should have been king. But, of course, he wasn't. So, I mean, by human standards, Jesus had every right to demand to be king of Israel. But, of course, he didn't, and that wasn't part of the plan of salvation, so that doesn't matter. A couple other things, if you want to write them down. In general, Matthew's genealogy follows mostly family names and heads of households, heads of clans and tribes. And in Mary's list, Mary's list or Luke's list, we have many individuals. And you're not always going to find those individuals from Mary's list repeated in Matthew's list. So this is why they're different names. Sometimes in Joseph's list, in Matthew, all they will list is the head of the clan. And then the next head of a clan. In Luke's list, they will name the actual individual who was the head of that clan. Okay? So that's the difference. That's why you sometimes will find different names in different lists. Also, again, Matthew, as I said, 14, 14, 14, he had a very special thing about his list, symmetry, if you will, in symbolism. Whereas Mary's not put together the same way. Also, the earliest name in Matthew's is Abraham. The earliest name in Mary's is Adam. So not only does Mary go back to the flesh and blood of David, Mary goes all the way back to the flesh and blood of Adam, the first created being, and you remember how that ends. When you read that, remember how that ends. Mary's genealogy ends when he talks about, and he was the son of Adam, who was the, anybody? Son of God, created by God. Okay? Literally the Son of God truly in a physical sense, which of course that's what Jesus is, Son of God, in both the physical sense and the eternal sense. Right? So it's important to notice these little things. This makes the genealogies more than just a blather of names. If you got frustrated reading through the names, I've told you before, don't worry about it. Say the first initial, the first letter, and go on. But God decided to put these two lists in the Bible for a reason, folks. And these are the reasons I'm giving you right now. These are the reasons they are there. And every single one of these names deserve, an hour study. Really, they do. Some of them it would be hard to do because we don't know hardly anything about them. Of course, others we do. We know lots about Abraham. We know lots about Jacob and Isaac and, that, and David, of course. But there's a lot of them we don't know hardly anything about. The only time they're ever in the Bible is in the genealogies, and you've got other Old Testament genealogies where they occur too. Okay. So in that last point, let me emphasize this way. In the last point, you've got Joseph's genealogy emphasizing Jesus' Jewishness, because this was the promise repeated to Abraham and his descendants, that one would come from his family. In Mary's genealogy, you have the emphasis on Jesus being a human being, a second Adam. Very important. If you don't write anything else down, write this down. Mary's line in Luke points to Jesus as the second Adam. This is really important later on for Paul. Paul picks up on this in our study on Tuesdays. Paul picks up on this whole thing and spends a lot of time talking about Jesus as the second Adam. Jesus cannot be the second Adam if his line does not go directly back to Adam. Well, guess what? Everybody's line goes directly back to Adam. But not everybody's line goes directly back to Adam through David. Okay? So Jesus is unique in that sense. So, very important, those things. One final thought before we try to wrap this up here. Oh, my goodness. Losing time here. One final thought. I've got my other page of notes. Where did I put them? Set them down. What did I do with them? No. What did I do with them? There's 3 sheets.
Don't you hate it when that happens?
I do. I really do. I must have taken them in the printing room. Let's see if I can remember. Basically, what I was going to say is that when you have the begats, and so begats, you will notice that in Mary's, for example, in Luke, there's no last begat. Okay? There's no last begat. Okay? Why? Well, because Adam wasn't begotten in that sense. He wasn't in a physical sense. He was created. So that's another little thing that, you kind of get used to reading that. And so-and-so begat so-and-so, begat so-and-so, begat so-and-so, begat so-and-so, begat so-and-so. And then all of a sudden, you don't have it. Just the Son of God, created by God. Okay? Which sets, again, Jesus through Mary apart. So that's just kind of the notes that I had here on that. If you want to know, if you want to look up other genealogies to match with some of this, you can to match especially with Matthew's. Let me give you one reference for that, and that would be 1 Chronicles chapter 1, verse 34. Through chapter 2, verse 15. Once again, that's 1 Chronicles 1, 34 through 2, 15. Okay, and you'll find a lot of comparisons between those two. All right, now your turn to ask questions.
Well, I have a statement on that. A lot of people make this mistake. You go 1, 2, 4, and then go 6, instead of going 8. They're not doubling.
Yeah, right.
And there's a lot more than what it is.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you wouldn't have $1 million of pennies that are doubled
Yeah, right.
every day,
Yeah.
30 days.
Let me just say too that should have put this in. I don't know that I did. There are missing links, shall we say? In other words, if you do look in the genealogies in the Old Testament, and you look at then the genealogies in the New Testament, you will find some gaps. Also, if you add up the names and if you add up the ages, you can estimate, as a generation, for example, 40 years, you don't come up with enough years. Say in Matthew's between Abraham and Jesus. You don't come up with a number of years. So what we know from that is this, that the names, as I say, the 14 names are names God chose, the Holy Spirit gave to Matthew for the purposes that I mentioned. Some names are left out. So it's not a direct son of. That's the importance of the word begat. Okay? If you say son of, you mean son of. Most people would just think, well, that means that's his father. But the old word begat means he could come any time after that. Could be a son, could be grandson, could be great-grandson.
There's a lot mentioned.
Yeah.
A lot of names mentioned in Matthew.
Yes.
Bunch of.
Yep. And so these are not all the names. There are names missing. There are generations missing. For whatever reason. It's God's choice. We don't know why, except that God wanted the 14.
So in other words, the ones that are mentioned here, there are more mentioned.
No,
What's in here.
there are more, we just don't know who they are. And there are some that are mentioned there that are not mentioned in Chronicles, or that are mentioned in Chronicles and not mentioned there. Yes. But again, the clarity and perspicuity of Scripture, which means the accurateness of Scripture, the doctrine of the inerrancy of Scripture, means that there are no mistakes. It's not a mistake. See, I can say, that I am a descendant of Christopher Spencer, who invented the Spencer carbine. Okay, but if I just say descendant, or if I say great-great-great-grandson, that's leaving a whole bunch of people out. Because he moved from the South, he moved to Massachusetts and wound up giving his invention to the darn Yankees. Oh, well. Well, that's because what? The gun industry was in Massachusetts. Everybody knows Springfield, Massachusetts, right? Springfield, Massachusetts. I mean, that's where the gun industry was for, centuries. So that's where he moved. He moved there. He was an inventor and he was the kind of guy who moved up there. It makes perfect sense. But, that's the way it goes. In any case, so to say that you are a son of somebody, that's one thing. That usually means first, second generation. If you say I'm a descendant of somebody, that could mean a lot of generations, and that could mean a lot of unnamed or unknown people. Okay? So remember that. And that's not as much true in Luke's genealogy as Matthew's genealogy, but it is still partially true. Yes, ma'am.
We can also say descendant of
Yeah. Yes, we can. Sure. And we can all say we're a descendant of Noah. And I think the vast majority of us would be able to say we're a descendant of Japheth. After that, I don't know. I don't know. But genealogy, like I said, it's a fun thing. I love doing it, but I don't do much of it because it does. It blows my whole day. And I don't... Oh, yeah, rabbit holes and great stories, sometimes great stories, wonderful stories, but yeah, you can get bogged down in it and it just robs you. You look up at the clock and 8 hours, 10 hours are gone. And I can't afford that. Yeah, it is. That's very hard. Although it's getting easier as years go on. They're doing some good work in that. I have on the Wallace side of the family, on the Jenkins side. On the Jenkins side of the family, one of my ancestors married a Cherokee princess, I guess it was. No, I'm one. You have to be, in order to get part with the Cherokees, of course, we're ensconced in Oklahoma. and they have casinos now and everything. But in order to get casino money or tribal money, you have to be 1/16th. And I'm 1/32nd. I'm the next one. My brothers and I are the next one. My dad, if he was still alive, he probably could apply for Cherokee money. But I don't know, but yeah, you have to be 1/16th. I don't know if that's the way it is in all tribes, but for the most part, it's something like that. I think some of them go a little further because there are so few. Yeah, but yeah. Anything else? Any other questions on the genealogy? It's a part of the Bible that everybody skips. Nobody spends much time on it. Nobody cares really one way or another about it. But there's, like I say, a lot of important thoughts in there, a lot of important points that God wanted to make. I didn't really answer the question as to why not 4. This goes back to the reason, the different reasons for the Gospels. Remember the Gospel of Matthew. I don't really think I talk about it in these notes here anywhere, but in the whole idea of the Gospel of Matthew is to reach out to the Jews. That's why God directed it to be written, and therefore Matthew is the one who repeats over and over again, as was prophesied in the Scriptures or in the Old Testament. He repeats that more than anybody else, because he is trying to convince his fellow Jews that Jesus is the Messiah. You want to do evangelistic work with Jewish people? Use the book of Matthew. That's what it's for. Mark is for 2 reasons. Mark has 2 purposes to it. One is it's very quick, it's very dynamic, it's very action-oriented. Mark does not play around with long speeches. Mark does not play around with long descriptions of things. Mark gets right to the point. There's a lot of action, a lot of miracles there. Boom, 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 boom. Mark was written for heathens. Mark was written for the pagans. Mark was written to convince people, to give them the story of the gospel short and sweet and to the point. Bang, bang, bang. No muss, no fuss. Mark is the shortest gospel, and it has the shortest sentences and has the simplest vocabulary. So if you're dealing with people that have no clue about God whatsoever, you're dealing with people that have very rudimentary education, you have dealing with people who don't like long sentences, long paragraphs, or long explanations, use Mark. Okay? Luke was written specifically for the civilized world, meaning the Greek and Roman world. Luke was a Roman himself, and he was a physician, highly trained, highly educated, lots of big words, lots of long sentences, lots of flowery descriptions, long speeches, long parables. Okay. Luke is the Tolstoy of the Gospels. Okay, long, drawn out, and very pedantic. By that I mean just really good descriptions and fills the details, like Tolstoy, like Herman Melville. You ever read Moby Dick? Herman Melville loves detail, just tons and tons of detail. Okay, so that's Luke. All right, and specifically for the Greeks and Romans, the civilized world. And finally, John. John was written 70 years, maybe not 70, 60 years at least after the other 3. And so its first purpose is to fill in the gaps. So for example, in the 3 Gospels, the first 3 Gospels, you have a lot of information on the Galilee ministry, not much information on the Judean ministry. In John, the other way around. Lots of information on the Judean ministry, less information on the Galilee ministry. So for example, in John, you've got those miracles in Jerusalem. The blind man, okay, the one was born blind. Got a couple chapters on that. You've also got in John long speeches by Jesus, very long prayers by Jesus, long parables by Jesus. You've got for example, huge chapters of 80 verses or so, that completely, they don't just describe the feeding of the 5,000 in a few verses. They tell everything that went on before and after, especially what Jesus said to people. Okay. You've got long discussions between Jesus and Nicodemus. Okay. You've got long discussions between Jesus and the woman at Samaria, and the woman of Samaria, the woman at the well. Right? And of course, you've got the beginning of John that's very philosophical. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And very, talking about the light of the world came into the world, and the world knew it not. And So John is written to fill in the gaps, but also kind of to raise the gospel up to a little higher level, a little, more of a thinking man's book. Okay, not just civilized thinking, not just educated people, but people who actually want to cogitate on something, ruminate on something. That's where John's coming from. And so John, of course, written, as I say, many decades after the other three. So that's why the other first three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are called the synopsis. Okay, they take a synopsis or a summary of Jesus' ministry, and they all pretty much agree. The stories are right alongside each other, pretty much in the same order, not always, but pretty much in the same order, and you can follow those three easy. Then you've got John, totally different material for the most part. Okay, so what does that have to do with the genealogies? Since Matthew was written for the Hebrews, you've got to have a genealogy in there. The Jews must know, they must be told that Jesus is legitimate, legal son of Joseph, even though he's not the fleshly son of Joseph. So it's very important. For the civilized people, especially the Romans, okay, very important for the Romans that Jesus is the flesh and blood son of David. Romans are very big on that because they are a system of a king and monarchy and emperorship and all that. They're very big on that. And so it's important if you're dealing with the Romans to make sure that you point out to the Romans that Jesus is from David. And it's also important to point out to the Romans because the Romans thought, hey, we own the whole world. The whole world is us. We everybody under our control. Therefore, by going back to Adam, you say, yeah, so what? Okay, Jesus is directly descended to Adam, and therefore he covers you too. Okay, so those are the reasons why. Mark doesn't need that. That's not who he's talking to. He's talking to a bunch of heathens. They don't know anything about genealogies anyway. And John, he looks at the genealogies of Matthew and Luke and he says, what can I add? I can't add anything to that. I'll talk about the genealogy from eternity. In the beginning was the Word. See? If you want to call that a genealogy, you can. And we talked about that last time. Okay, your assignment for our next meeting, okay, which will be I believe the 10th of December, if I'm correct. Look at the calendar real quick here.
Right.
December. Yes, our next meeting for the Life of Christ study will be the 10th of December, and your assignment is to read Luke 1:26 to 38, 39 to 56, and Matthew 1:18 to 25. And we will try to handle those 3 points of Jesus' life: Gabriel's visit to Mary, Mary's visit to Elizabeth, and the angel comes to Joseph. Excuse me?
Chapters and verse, I didn't get them all down. Oh.
So yeah, and then you can put your own notes there, your own questions if you want, or wait and then find out what you want to find out from me. But yes, come with questions. Please do. Come with questions. That's always good. Other people always appreciate that, I know. Okay, I didn't go too much over. You are free. Free. 3. Yeah, now it's quiet. Well, if I'm